caught my nephew vandalizing my car because I wouldn't lend his dad money. The court order for restitution was satisfying. The whole thing started 3 months ago when my brother showed up at my door looking like he hadn't slept in days. He had this desperate look in his eyes that I'd seen before, usually right before he asked for something he couldn't afford. We stood there in my driveway for what felt like forever, him shifting his weight from foot to foot, me waiting for whatever bomb he was about to drop. He needed $15,000. Not wanted, needed. His business was going under, some supply chain issue mixed with a couple of clients who decided they didn't want to pay their invoices. The way he explained it, this wasn't just about saving his company anymore, it was about keeping his house, keeping his family together. He had that tone people get when they're trying to convince you that their crisis is somehow your responsibility too. I felt terrible saying no. This wasn't some random person asking for money. This was my brother, the same guy who used to share his lunch with me when we were kids, who taught me how to ride a bike and threw a baseball with me every day after school. But I'd been down this road with him before. 5 years ago, it was $8,000 for some equipment that was going to revolutionize his business. 3 years before that, it was $3,000 to cover payroll during a rough patch. Every time he promised it would be the last time, every time he had this foolproof plan to pay me back with interest. The money never came back. Not once. And it wasn't like I was swimming in cash either. I had my own mortgage, my own bills, my own retirement to think about. I'd worked hard to build up some savings, and watching it disappear into the black hole of his financial decisions was something I just couldn't do again. He didn't take it well. Started talking about family loyalty, about how blood should mean something, about how I was sitting pretty while he was drowning. That stung more than I expected it to. Made me question whether I was being reasonable or just selfish. But I held my ground, told him I couldn't do it, told him I was sorry, but the answer was no. He left that day without saying goodbye. Just walked to his car, slammed the door, and drove off. I stood there watching his taillights disappear down my street, feeling like the worst person in the world. That night I barely slept, running through the conversation over and over, wondering if I'd made the right choice. The next few weeks were awkward. Family gatherings became these tense affairs where we'd nod at each other politely, but avoid any real conversation. His wife seemed to understand, gave me these sympathetic looks when she thought no one was watching. But I could tell she was caught in the middle, trying to keep the peace while her husband was clearly bitter about the whole situation. Their son, my nephew, was 17 and had always been a good kid. Quiet, polite, helped out around the house without being asked. He played on the school soccer team, got decent grades, never caused any trouble. I'd always liked him, thought he had a good head on his shoulders, despite some of the chaos in his family life. He'd come over sometimes just to hang out, play video games, talk about whatever was going on in his world. But after the money situation, those visits stopped. When I'd see him at family events, he'd barely make eye contact. I figured his dad had told him some version of the story that painted me as the villain, explained how Uncle was too selfish to help when they really needed it. It hurt, but I understood. Kids usually side with their parents, especially when they're only getting one side of the story. What I didn't realize was how much pressure the whole situation was putting on him. His parents were fighting more, money was tight, and there was this constant tension in the house. He was hearing conversations he shouldn't have been hearing, picking up on stress that no teenager should have to deal with. And somewhere in his mind, he decided that I was the reason for all of it. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in late September. I was getting ready for work, running a few minutes behind like usual, when I walked out to my car and stopped dead in my tracks. There was a long scratch down the passenger side, deep enough that I could see the metal underneath. It ran from the front wheel well almost to the rear bumper, perfectly straight like someone had taken their time with it. My first thought was that it must have happened in the parking lot at work, some careless person opening their door too wide or backing out without looking. These things happen, right? Cars get dinged and scratched all the time. But something about it bothered me. It was too deliberate, too precise. This wasn't an accident. I filed a report with my insurance company, paid the deductible, got it fixed. Cost me about $800 out of pocket after everything was said and done. The whole time I had this nagging feeling that I was missing something, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. 2 weeks later, it happened again. This time it was my driver's side mirror, completely shattered. The housing was intact, but the glass was in a million pieces all over my driveway. I found myself standing there at 6 in the morning, still in my pajamas, staring at the mess and trying to figure out what was going on. That's when I started paying attention to the timing. Both incidents had happened overnight, between the time I got home from work and the time I left the next morning. Someone was coming to my house specifically to damage my car. This wasn't random vandalism, this was personal. I started parking in my garage when I could, but it was full of storage boxes and old furniture that I'd been meaning to deal with for months. Most nights I was too tired to shuffle everything around just to fit the car inside. Besides, I lived in a decent neighborhood, had good relationships with my neighbors. The idea that someone was targeting me specifically felt almost paranoid. But the incidents kept happening. A week after the mirror, someone keyed a long zigzag pattern across my hood. Then it was sugar in my gas tank, which cost me a fortune to fix and left me without a car for 3 days. Each time I filed a police report, each time they took notes and said they'd keep an eye out, but there was never any evidence, never any witnesses. I started losing sleep over it. Would lie awake at night listening for sounds outside, jumping at every little noise. Started checking my car obsessively before getting in, looking for new damage, new ways someone had tried to mess with me. It was affecting my work, my relationships, my whole sense of security. The breaking point came when I woke up one morning to find all 4 of my tires slashed. Not just punctured, but completely destroyed. Long cuts through the sidewalls that made them impossible to repair. I stood there looking at my car listing to one side like a wounded animal, and something inside me snapped. This was going to stop. Today, I called in sick to work and drove my rental car to the electronics store. Spent the morning researching security cameras, talking to the sales guy about what would work best for monitoring my driveway. I wanted something with night vision, something that would record clear footage even in the dark. I was done being a victim. Setting up the system took most of the afternoon. I mounted cameras at 2 different angles, made sure they covered every approach to where I parked. Ran the cables through my house to a recorder in my basement, set up the app on my phone so I could monitor everything remotely. It felt good to be doing something proactive instead of just waiting for the next attack. For the first week, nothing happened. I started to wonder if maybe the vandal had gotten bored, moved on to someone else, or just decided it wasn't worth the risk anymore. Part of me hoped that was the case. Despite everything, I didn't really want to catch whoever was doing this. I just wanted it to stop. But on the following Wednesday night, my phone buzzed with a motion alert at 2:47 a.m. I was instantly awake, heart pounding as I opened the app and watched the live feed. Someone was in my driveway, moving slowly toward my car. They were wearing dark clothes, a hood pulled up, face hidden in shadow. I watched them approach my car with what looked like a screwdriver in their hand. They moved with confidence, like they'd done this before, like they knew exactly what they were doing. My finger hovered over the button to call the police, but something made me wait. I wanted to see who this was, wanted to know why they were targeting me. They started working on my driver's side door, trying to scratch their initials or some symbol into the paint. That's when they turned slightly toward the camera, and the motion sensor light kicked on, illuminating their face for just a second. It was my nephew. The kid I'd known since he was born, who used to fall asleep on my couch watching movies, who asked me for advice about girls in school and all the normal stuff teenagers worry about. He was standing in my driveway at 3 in the morning, deliberately damaging my car, and I couldn't process what I was seeing. My first instinct was to run outside and confront him, to ask him what the hell he thought he was doing. But something held me back. Maybe it was the shock of recognition, or maybe some part of me realized that this moment was bigger than just catching someone in the act. This was about family, about loyalty, about the consequences of decisions that adults make and kids have to live with. So I kept recording. Watched him finish whatever he was carving into my door, watched him step back to admire his work, watched him walk away down the street like he owned the place. The whole thing took maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Just sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, staring at the recorded footage on my phone, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do next. This wasn't some random punk from the neighborhood. This was family. This was my brother's son, a kid who was acting out because his world was falling apart and he needed someone to blame. By morning, I'd made my decision. I was going to call the police. I know how that sounds. What kind of person calls the cops on their own nephew? What kind of uncle chooses property damage over family loyalty? But as I sat there thinking about it, I realized that letting this slide wouldn't actually help anyone. It wouldn't help my nephew learn that actions have consequences, and it wouldn't help me feel safe in my own home. The detective who took my case was a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She looked at the footage I'd compiled, nodded approvingly at the camera angles, and told me I had a solid case. The video clearly showed the vandalism, clearly showed the perpetrator's face, clearly established a pattern of behavior over several months. She asked me about my relationship with the suspect, and I told her the truth. Explained about the loan request, about the tension in the family, about how I'd noticed changes in my nephew's behavior over the past few months. She listened without judgment, took notes, asked follow-up questions that showed she understood the complexity of the situation. The arrest happened 3 days later. I wasn't there to see it, but I heard about it from other family members. He was at school when they came for him, got pulled out of his physics class, and taken to the principal's office where the police were waiting. They were respectful about it, didn't make a scene, but news travels fast in a small town. By the end of the day, everyone knew what had happened. The phone calls started that evening. My brother was furious, screaming about how I'd destroyed his son's future over a few scratches on a car. His wife was crying, begging me to drop the charges, promising they'd pay for all the damages if I'd just let it go. Other family members chimed in with their opinions, some supporting my decision, others acting like I'd committed some unforgivable sin. The hardest call was from my nephew himself. He was out on bail, staying with his parents, trying to process what was happening to him. His voice was different, smaller somehow, like the reality of the situation had finally hit him. He told me he was sorry, that he never meant for it to go this far, that he was just angry and didn't know how to handle it. I believed him. Could hear the genuine remorse in his voice, the fear of what was coming next. But I also knew that sorry doesn't undo months of damage, doesn't erase the sleepless nights or the feeling of being violated in your own home. Actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences are bigger than we expect them to be. The legal process took months. Court dates, paperwork, meetings with prosecutors and defense attorneys. My nephew had hired a decent lawyer who tried to argue that this was just a family dispute, that criminal charges were excessive for what amounted to property damage between relatives. The prosecutor countered that vandalism is vandalism regardless of family relationships, that letting people off the hook because they're related sets a dangerous precedent. I testified about the pattern of damage, about the impact it had on my life, about the video evidence that clearly showed deliberate and repeated criminal behavior. It wasn't easy, sitting in that courtroom with my brother glaring at me from the gallery, knowing that my words might send my nephew to jail. But the most surprising moment came when my nephew's lawyer called a character witness. It was his soccer coach, a guy who'd known him for 3 years and had nothing but good things to say about his character. The coach talked about leadership, about responsibility, about how this kid had never been in trouble before and didn't deserve to have his future destroyed over a mistake. That's when the prosecutor revealed something that changed everything. The investigation had turned up evidence of other vandalism incidents in the neighborhood, other cars that had been damaged in similar ways. My nephew wasn't just targeting me, he was on a vandalism spree that had affected at least 6 other families over the past 4 months. Suddenly, this wasn't just about family drama anymore. This was about a pattern of criminal behavior that went way beyond whatever anger he felt toward me. The other victims had filed their own reports, had their own security footage, had their own stories of feeling unsafe in their own homes. The judge was not impressed. During sentencing, she talked about the violation of trust, about the impact on the community, about the importance of taking responsibility for one's actions. She sentenced my nephew to 60 days in juvenile detention, 2 years of probation, and restitution for all the damage he'd caused. The restitution was the part that really hit home. The judge ordered him to pay back every penny of damage he'd caused, not just to me, but to all his victims. Insurance deductibles, repair costs, rental car fees, security system installations. When it was all added up, the total came to just over $12,000. $12,000. Almost the exact amount my brother had asked me to loan him months earlier. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in that courtroom. My brother's face went white when the judge read the final amount. His wife started crying again, this time not from sadness, but from the crushing realization of what this meant for their family finances. They were already struggling, already behind on bills, and now they had a massive debt hanging over their heads. My nephew took the news better than I expected. He stood up straight, looked the judge in the eye, and said he understood. Said he took full responsibility for what he'd done and would do whatever it took to make things right. There was something different about him in that moment, something more mature, like he'd finally grasped the weight of his actions. The juvenile detention was tough on him, but probably necessary. 60 days away from his friends, away from his normal life, away from the comfort of home. When he got out, he was quieter, more thoughtful. The anger that had been driving him seemed to have burned itself out, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. The restitution payments started right away. He got an after-school job at a local grocery store, working every evening and weekend to earn money toward his debt. His parents helped when they could, but their own financial situation was still precarious. Progress was slow, $20 or $30 at a time, but it was progress. I watched him working, saw him bagging groceries with the same concentration he used to bring to his soccer games. There was something dignified about it, something that suggested he was taking the whole thing seriously. He wasn't just going through the motions or counting down the days until his debt was paid. He was learning something. The first payment he made to me was $47, all in small bills and loose change. He handed it to me personally, looked me in the eye, and apologized again. Not the quick, dismissive apology of someone who just wants to move on, but a real acknowledgement of what he'd done and how it had affected me. I took the money, but I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd expected. Instead, I felt something more complicated, something that mixed vindication with sadness. This kid was paying for his mistakes, literally and figuratively, but at what cost? His relationship with his father was strained, his college prospects were uncertain, and he was spending his teenage years working to pay off a debt that had started with his parents' financial problems. The family dynamics shifted in unexpected ways. My brother and I started talking again, not about the loan or the vandalism, but about smaller things. How work was going, how the weather was affecting his business, whether the local team had any chance of making the playoffs. Careful conversations that avoided the landmines of recent history. His wife was actually the one who brought up the elephant in the room. She called me one evening, about 6 months after the sentencing, and thanked me for what I'd done. Said she knew it couldn't have been easy, knew it had cost me relationships and caused me stress, but that her son needed to learn this lesson. Said she was proud of how he was handling his punishment and thought it would make him a better person in the long run. That conversation meant more to me than I expected it to. Validation from someone who understood both sides of the situation, who could see past the immediate pain to the bigger picture. It didn't make everything okay, but it helped me feel less like the villain in my nephew's story. The most surprising development came about a year later. My nephew had been making steady progress on his restitution payments, had stayed out of trouble, had even managed to keep his grades up despite working 20 hours a week. His probation officer was impressed with his attitude and his commitment to making things right. But the real shock came when I got a call from the prosecutor's office. There had been another vandalism incident in the neighborhood, similar to the ones my nephew had been convicted of. Security footage showed a different perpetrator, someone who'd been operating in the area for months before my nephew ever got involved. The investigation revealed that my nephew hadn't been the mastermind behind the vandalism spree. He'd been following the lead of an older kid, someone who'd convinced him that targeting certain houses was some kind of justified revenge against adults who had wronged them. My nephew had been manipulated by someone who understood his anger and channeled it toward destructive ends. This didn't excuse what he'd done, didn't change the fact that he'd made the choice to damage property and hurt people. But it provided context that made his actions more understandable, more human. He wasn't some calculating criminal. He was a confused teenager who'd been led astray by someone more experienced in causing trouble. The revelation actually brought our family closer together. My brother and I could finally talk about what had happened without it feeling like we were choosing sides. We could acknowledge that we'd all made mistakes, that the situation had been more complicated than any of us realized, and that everyone involved had learned something from the experience. My nephew continued making his restitution payments, but now they felt less like punishment and more like a commitment to finishing what he'd started. He'd grown up a lot over the past year, developed a work ethic that impressed his boss, learned to manage his time and his money in ways that would serve him well in adulthood. The final payment came on a Tuesday in March, almost 2 years after the sentencing. He handed me an envelope with the last $200, plus a handwritten letter thanking me for holding him accountable. The letter was thoughtful, articulate, and showed a level of self-reflection that impressed me. In it, he talked about how angry he'd been after his family's financial problems started, how he'd felt powerless and looking for someone to blame. He wrote about the influence of the older kid who'd encouraged the vandalism, about how easy it had been to convince himself that damaging property was somehow justified. But he also wrote about the lessons he'd learned, about responsibility and consequences, and the importance of thinking before acting. The letter ended with something that surprised me. He thanked me for calling the police, for not letting him off the hook just because we were family. Said he realized now that enabling his behavior wouldn't have helped anyone, that he needed to face the consequences of his actions in order to truly move past them. Reading that letter, I felt something I hadn't expected. Pride. Not in myself, but in him. In the young man he'd become through this difficult process, in the maturity he'd developed, in the responsibility he'd taken for his actions. The kid who'd been vandalizing cars in the middle of the night was gone, replaced by someone who understood the weight of his choices. The court order for restitution was officially satisfied that day, but the real resolution had happened months earlier. It had happened in the gradual rebuilding of trust, in the slow process of earning forgiveness, in the transformation of an angry teenager into a responsible young adult. My brother's business eventually stabilized, though it took longer than anyone expected. He never asked me for money again, and I never offered. We both understood that our relationship had changed, that the easy assumption of family support had been replaced by something more complicated, but ultimately more honest. The experience taught me something about the difference between helping someone and enabling them. Sometimes the most caring thing you can do is let someone face the consequences of their actions, even when it's painful to watch. Sometimes love means saying no, even when saying yes would be easier. My nephew graduated high school on time, despite everything. Got accepted to a state university with a partial scholarship for soccer. His work ethic and maturity impressed the coaches, and his essay about learning from his mistakes apparently resonated with the admissions committee. He was going to be fine, maybe better than fine. At his graduation party, he pulled me aside to thank me again. Not for the letter or the restitution process, but for something else entirely. He thanked me for treating him like an adult, for holding him to adult standards, for not making excuses for his behavior just because he was young or because our families were close. Standing there in my brother's backyard, watching this kid who'd caused me so much trouble and stress and sleepless nights, I felt something I'd never expected to feel. Gratitude. Not for the vandalism or the court case or the family drama, but for the opportunity to be part of his growth, to to play a role in his transformation from an angry teenager into a responsible young man. The security cameras are still up at my house, though I rarely check the footage anymore. They serve as a reminder, not of the vandalism, but of the importance of being prepared, of taking responsibility for your own safety and security. They're also a reminder that sometimes the people who hurt us are the ones we love most, and that loving them sometimes means letting them face the consequences of their actions. The whole experience changed how I think about family, about responsibility, about the difference between helping and enabling. It taught me that accountability isn't the opposite of love, it's a form of love. Sometimes the most caring thing you can do for someone is refuse to shield them from the natural consequences of their choices. My nephew is in his sophomore year of college now, studying business with a minor in ethics. He calls me sometimes, not to apologize or relitigate the past, but just to talk about his classes, his plans for the future, his thoughts on whatever's happening in the world. Normal conversations between family members who have been through something difficult together and come out stronger on the other side. The court order for restitution was satisfied years ago, but the real satisfaction came from watching someone learn and grow and become a better person through the process. That's worth more than any amount of money, more than any damaged car, more than any temporary family drama. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel good in the moment. Sometimes it feels terrible, like you're betraying the people you care about most. But looking back now, I know I made the right choice. Not just for me, but for my nephew, for my family, for the community that had been affected by his actions. The scratches on my car are long gone, buffed out and painted over until there's no trace they were ever there. But the lessons learned, the growth achieved, the relationships rebuilt on stronger foundations, those are permanent. Those are the things that matter in the end.